South Africa's heavy reliance on coal for electricity has made it a prime candidate for a world-first funding agreement aimed at ramping up investments in clean energy. But over 2 years after it was announced, the Just Energy Transition Partnership has made little tangible progress on the ground. Yesterday, the Presidential Climate Commission recommended that South Africa establish a body to guide investment in the energy transition. The recommendations come amid frustration at the slow pace of Just Energy Transition Partnership that South Africa secured in 2021 with the US, the UK, Germany, France and the European Union. Researchers are also raising questions about how money that South Africa, or how much money South Africa was given to mitigate climate change and how it's been spent. For more on this, we are joined by researcher on the Climate and Inequality Project at the Southern Centre for Inequality Studies at Wits University, Julia Taylor. Good to have you, Julia. Thank you very much for your time.
Good morning, and thanks for having me.
So the whole basis of this was at a COP26, I beg your pardon. South Africa launched that Just Energy Transition Partnership. How has that been achieved, and where are we? Where is it going?
So currently, there is quite a lot of uncertainty about where we are with the funding that was committed in 2021. A major focus of ours has been what has happened to the grant portion of that funding. So the total amount was $8.6 billion, which is about 128 billion rand. And only 4% of that was committed in grants. And so that means the majority of the funding is actually in loans. What the JETP Project Management Unit, the PMU, have done is publish the grant register, which lists the different grants that have been made in line with the JETP. But we've done an analysis of this grant register, and we found, some issues in terms of timing. So already kind of half of the money was already spent by the time that the Just Energy Transition Investment Plan was launched for comment, which means the public haven't really had much input into how this grant has been channeled. Yeah. So at the moment, we're a little bit uncertain about what the loan portion, which is the majority of this funding, is going towards.
Yeah, and that's a concern, because I mean, we need to know actually what's going on. I mean, if we can just take a little closer look at this to determine, and I know you did this, you looked closer to determine who the money's gone to, when it was dispersed, and what it was actually spent on. Perhaps you can let us into what you've actually discovered.
Yes, sure. So the money so far that we are kind of have access to understanding, the kind of public information about the grants, is only 4% of the total amount. But we've done an analysis of the register that was published, which we actually commend the PMU for doing, for trying to have that transparency. But when we do the analysis, we find that actually 76% of the grants have gone towards international entities like development agencies that will then transfer that money through their own programs into, hopefully, development initiatives. But the problem with that is that we still don't actually know who the final beneficiary is, who's receiving that grant and who's benefiting from it. Mm. And based on our analysis, we find that it seems that the portion of funding that has gone to skills and kind of worker compensation, workers who are in these affected sectors that are going to be, potentially losing jobs because of this transition, is very small. So the majority of the funding, the grant funding, which is also arguably should be targeted at these kind of social and justice issues, has kind of gone towards green hydrogen initiatives, electricity infrastructure, which are important for the just transition, but there are skills initiatives and kind of municipalities that really need this funding because they're so heavily reliant on coal. Yeah. And so we kind of need some more input from civil society, worker organizations on how this money is being spent.
Yeah.
But unfortunately, it does seem like the international funding institutions have quite a significant influence on what that money is being spent on.
Yeah, and that's what's of vital importance. I mean, because at the moment, in the backdrop in all of this, we've got President Ramaphosa. He was at the summit that's currently taking place at the moment, but he's tasked his presidential climate commission to hold in-depth public consultations as early as 2023 on this jet investment plan as inputs for the design of the implementation plan. However, I know what you're saying is that you're actually concerned that a lack of transparency around it threatens to quickly erode public trust in this entire project. Perhaps the lack of transparency is what we need to understand a little bit more.
Yes, I agree. And I want to emphasize that it's not only kind of a kind of issue in terms of the grants, it's also the broader funding, which is actually coming in the form of loans. And what we really don't know at the moment is where those loans have gone and whether there've been any conditions associated with the loans that South African, government entities, Treasury is now going to have to abide by. A broader point around climate justice is that these developed countries are disproportionately responsible for the emissions that have caused climate change. And so within the UN kind of climate change conference and negotiation processes, they have agreed to provide funding for countries like South Africa, who do have a contribution, but which is much smaller relatively, to provide funding to countries like South Africa. And so when we get that funding only in the form of loans, it raises questions about, well, is that really, addressing the aims of climate justice, which would see a lot of money coming from those developed and industrialized countries into developing countries to mitigate climate change and adapt.
And it could get us into trouble. And this is the reality with loans like that. And we don't really know. I mean, I'm reading off your report. It's basically saying what is staggering is that there has been no transparency around recipient and project selection. That's another thing. And this raises the question whether only entities with the right connections have been able to access the funding and the repayment terms around that. So, this is it's a very interesting discussion and one that needs to be taken very seriously because there's been a lot of criticism around this, and even to the point that's saying that the deal is too modest in its promise, it's too slow in its implementation, and too little spent by donors. I mean, if we look over these 2 years in the partnership, has anything tangible been achieved? I mean, can we look at something and say, wow, well, this happened and this is something to be very proud of?
Unfortunately, those kinds of tangible project outputs haven't been made public. So they might be happening on the ground in various dispersed in a dispersed way, but we haven't seen a cohesive reporting structure that provides these updates on what the funding has gone towards, who has benefited, what the projects involve. Unfortunately, the grant register is, as I say, quite opaque in that it tells us that the funding is going to a development agency, but not who that project or that development agency is then funding. But I also want to kind of point out that the transparency is not only kind of for what the South African government is doing. It's actually, these are international partners who also have development agencies and frameworks. And when we did have an engagement with some of these international partners and ask for clarity on this, they said, well, you can go and look at each of our individual development agency websites and find the information. But that's not, that's not supporting kind of open access and providing the information when it's needed. Expecting, everyday people to go and look at each different website, and some of these documents are in German when it's a German development agency. We actually need to have a consolidated and open system that shows how the money is being spent, by whom, and what are the conditions, not only on the grant side, but also on the loans.
Yeah, it certainly is a good point. And And I mean, we don't know. I mean, sorry, a very quick, simple yes or no. I mean, did you know if any of these negotiators actually conducted genuine consultation with the communities, labour, environmental critics of Eskom? Was any of that conducted?
So it's a little bit confusing because when the Just Energy Transition Investment Plan was launched in November 2021, as I mentioned, actually half of this grant funding had already been spent. So only after November 2021, then the PCC, the Presidential Climate Commission, did conduct quite extensive consultations. But the consultations then came after the launch of the document. Sure. So arguably, many civil society organizations are saying this is putting the cart before the horse, and we should have been consulted before it was launched officially at the COP. So there was kind of consultation afterwards. And then what's happened is they've released a Just Energy Transition Implementation Plan.
Okay.
So with all the acronyms being very confusing, there's the Just Energy Transition Partnership, which is like the group of international partners. Then there's the Just Energy Transition Investment Plan, which was the initial document that was launched. And then the consultations were accounted for, and some of those inputs were taken up in the next version, which was a Just Energy Transition Implementation Plan.
Sure.
And some of the examples of additions to that section are skills, and a focus on skills and municipalities, as well as looking at, and a statement that they wanted to look at kind of transport and road to rail, and the structural kind of renewable energy industrialization plans in the future.
Julia, I've got to leave it there. Sorry, I wish we could talk a bit longer, but really giving us some insight into that. Julia Taylor, researcher on the Climate and Inequality Project at the Southern Centre for Inequality Studies at Wits University.